Freedom Forged in Fire. The Birth of the United States. Introduction. A World Yet Unnamed. In the year 1776, the United States of America did not yet exist. Along the eastern edge of North America stretched 13 British colonies, diverse in character, divided by geography, yet bound together by language, commerce, and a growing sense of shared identity. They were loyal subjects of the British Crown, proud of their heritage and beneficiaries of the empire's protection. But beneath the surface of prosperity, tension was building. The Atlantic Ocean, once a bridge between colony and mother country, began to feel like a barrier. Decisions affecting colonial lives were made in London, thousands of miles away. Laws were passed by a parliament in which the colonists had no elected representatives. The question slowly emerged, first in whispers and later in bold declaration. Were the colonists merely subjects of a king, or were they entitled to the rights of free-born Englishmen? This question would ignite a revolution and give birth to a nation. Chapter 1. The Cost of Empire. The roots of the American Revolution lie not in sudden rebellion, but in the aftermath of victory. In 1763, Great Britain emerged triumphant from the French and Indian War, the North American theater of the global 7 Years' War. France had been driven from Canada, and British power on the continent stood unchallenged. Yet victory came at a cost. Britain's national debt had nearly doubled. Maintaining troops in North America to secure its new territories required steady funding. British leaders reasoned that the colonies, beneficiaries of imperial protection, should shoulder part of the financial burden. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, imposing a direct tax on printed materials in the colonies. Legal documents, newspapers, licenses, even playing cards required an official stamp purchased by British authorities. To British lawmakers, the tax seemed modest and reasonable. To American colonists, it represented something far more dangerous. The issue was not merely financial, it was constitutional. Colonists argued that taxation without representation in Parliament violated their rights as Englishmen. They had their own colonial assemblies, and they believed only those assemblies had the authority to levy taxes upon them. Protests erupted across the colonies. Merchants boycotted British goods. Crowds gathered in city streets. Effigies of tax collectors were burned. The Stamp Act Congress convened in New York, marking one of the first unified colonial responses to British policy. Parliament eventually repealed the Stamp Act, but it also passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The conflict was no longer about a single tax, it was about sovereignty. Chapter 2. From Protest to Defiance. Over the next decade, tensions deepened. New duties were imposed under the Townshend Acts. British troops were stationed in colonial cities, particularly Boston, where resistance was strongest. The presence of red-coated soldiers in narrow colonial streets intensified resentment. In 1770, violence erupted in what became known as the Boston Massacre. A confrontation between civilians and British soldiers ended in gunfire. 5 colonists lay in the snow. Though the incident was complex and chaotic, it was quickly transformed into powerful propaganda for the Patriot cause. Then, in 1773, came the Tea Act. Designed to rescue the struggling British East India Company, the act granted it a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. Though it lowered the price of tea, it maintained the principle of parliamentary taxation. To many colonists, accepting the tea meant accepting Parliament's authority. On a cold December night in Boston Harbor, a group of men disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded British ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. The Boston Tea Party was both theatrical and defiant, a bold rejection of imperial control. Britain responded with punishment. The coercive acts, known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts, closed Boston Harbor and curtailed self-government in Massachusetts. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, these measures united the colonies in sympathy. In 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They petitioned the king for redress of grievances while preparing for the possibility of armed resistance. The line between protest and revolution had begun to blur. Chapter 3. The Shot Heard Round the World. War began not with a declaration, but with a confrontation. In April 1775, British troops marched toward Concord, Massachusetts, intending to seize colonial military supplies. At Lexington, they encountered a small militia of armed farmers. A shot rang out, its origin still debated, and within minutes, the skirmish had begun. By the end of the day, colonial militias had forced British forces to retreat to Boston under heavy fire. The American Revolutionary War had begun. The Second Continental Congress convened shortly thereafter. Though many delegates still hoped for reconciliation, events pushed them toward independence. George Washington of Virginia was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, a symbolic gesture of unity between North and South. Washington faced daunting challenges. His army was inexperienced, poorly supplied, and often unpaid. Soldiers lacked adequate clothing and weapons. Desertion was common, yet Washington understood that survival itself could be a form of victory. If the Continental Army endured, the revolution lived. Meanwhile, a pamphlet published in early 1776 transformed public opinion. Thomas Paine's Common Sense argued plainly and powerfully for independence. Monarchy, Paine wrote, was an absurd relic. America had the opportunity to create something new, something grounded in liberty and republican principles. His words resonated deeply. Chapter 4. Declaring Independence. By the summer of 1776, reconciliation seemed impossible. On July 4th, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, primarily drafted by Thomas Jefferson. The document was more than a list of grievances. It was a philosophical statement rooted in Enlightenment ideals. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These words articulated a radical vision. Government derived its legitimacy from the consent of the governed. When a government became destructive of natural rights, the people had the authority to alter or abolish it. The signers understood the risks. By affixing their names, they committed treason against the British Crown, a crime punishable by death. The United States of America had declared itself a nation. Now it had to survive. Chapter 5. Trials of War. The Revolutionary War stretched for 8 grueling years. Early defeats tested American resolve. New York fell to British forces. The Continental Army endured a harsh winter at Valley Forge, where hunger and disease claimed many lives. Yet perseverance paid dividends. In 1777, American forces secured a crucial victory at Saratoga. The triumph convinced France that the American cause was viable. In 1778, France formally allied with the United States, providing military and naval support that would prove decisive. The struggle for American independence became part of a broader contest of empires. In 1781, combined American and French forces trapped General Cornwallis at Yorktown, Virginia. After weeks of siege, Cornwallis surrendered. Though fighting continued briefly elsewhere, Yorktown effectively ended major combat operations. 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris formally recognized the independence of the United States. A new nation stood on the world stage. Chapter 6: The Fragile Republic. Independence solved one problem, but revealed another: how to govern. Under the Articles of Confederation, the national government possessed limited authority. It could not effectively levy taxes or regulate interstate commerce. Economic instability and internal unrest, most notably Shays' Rebellion, exposed the weaknesses of the system. In 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia to revise the Articles. Instead, they drafted an entirely new constitution. The Constitution created a federal system balancing power between national and state governments. It established 3 branches: legislative, executive, and judicial, each designed to check and balance the others. After intense debate, the Constitution was ratified in 1788. To address concerns about individual liberties, the Bill of Rights was added in 1791, guaranteeing freedoms of speech, religion, press, assembly, and due process. The American experiment in self-government had entered a new phase. Conclusion: an ongoing promise. The story of America's founding is not a simple tale of triumph. It is a story of contradictions and unfinished promises. The declaration that all men are created equal coexisted with slavery. Native nations were displaced as the Republic expanded westward. Women were excluded from political participation. Yet the ideals articulated in 1776 endured and would be invoked by future generations seeking justice and reform. The American Revolution was not merely a colonial rebellion. It was a bold assertion that ordinary people could govern themselves. It reshaped global politics and inspired movements for liberty around the world. From 13 fragile colonies emerged a republic grounded in an idea that freedom, though costly and imperfect, is worth defending. And that idea continues to shape the United States to this day. A nation tested and transformed. Chapter 7: The Westward Dream. With independence secured and a constitution in place, the United States entered the 19th century as a fragile but ambitious republic. Its leaders believed deeply in expansion, not merely of land, but of opportunity. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson completed the Louisiana Purchase, acquiring vast territory from France and doubling the nation's size. The acquisition stretched from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. It was a bold move, one that reshaped the destiny of the Republic. Explorers Lewis and Clark journeyed westward to map the new lands. Their expedition symbolized the spirit of discovery that defined the young nation. To many Americans, westward expansion seemed both natural and inevitable, a belief later described as manifest destiny. But expansion carried consequences. Native American nations who had lived across these lands for centuries faced displacement and violence. Treaties were negotiated and broken. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act forced thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral homes in the Southeast. The Cherokee, among others, were marched west in what became known as the Trail of Tears, a journey marked by hunger, disease, and death. The nation's growth was real, but so was its moral cost. Chapter 8: Slavery and the Gathering Storm. While the United States expanded geographically, it remained deeply divided internally. The institution of slavery stood at the center of that division. In the southern states, plantation agriculture depended on enslaved labor, particularly for cotton production. In the North, industrialization was transforming society, and abolitionist movements were gaining strength. The moral contradiction between liberty and slavery became impossible to ignore. Political compromises attempted to maintain balance between free and slave states. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, and later the Kansas-Nebraska Act all sought to prevent disunion. Yet each temporary solution deepened resentment. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1960 on a platform opposing the expansion of slavery, Southern states chose secession. They formed the Confederate States of America, believing their economic system and political autonomy were under threat. In April 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter. The Civil War had begun. Chapter 9. The Trial by Fire. The Civil War would become the deadliest conflict in American history. More than 600,000 soldiers lost their lives. Entire cities were devastated. Families were divided. At first, the war was fought to preserve the Union, but in 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring enslaved people in Confederate territory free. The war's purpose expanded. It became a struggle for human freedom. African American soldiers joined the Union Army in large numbers, fighting courageously for a liberty long denied to them. Battles at Gettysburg and Vicksburg shifted momentum toward the Union. In 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. The Union was preserved. Slavery was abolished through the 13th Amendment. Yet the end of war did not mean the end of struggle. Chapter 11. Industry, Immigration, and Modern Power. As the 19th century turned into the 20th, the United States underwent dramatic transformation. Railroads connected coast to coast. Steel mills, oil refineries, and factories powered economic growth. Cities expanded rapidly. Millions of immigrants arrived from Europe and Asia seeking opportunity. They brought languages, traditions, and skills that reshaped American society. Their labor built infrastructure, fueled industry, and strengthened the nation's economic foundation. Yet industrial growth brought inequality. Workers endured long hours in dangerous conditions. Labor unions organized strikes demanding fair wages and protections. Tensions between wealth and labor defined the era. By the early 20th century, the United States had emerged as an industrial giant, its influence expanding beyond its borders. Chapter 12. War and Global Leadership. The 20th century thrust America onto the global stage. In World War I, American troops joined Allied forces in Europe, helping secure victory. Though the nation briefly turned inward afterward, global conflict returned with devastating force in 1941 when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. World War II mobilized the entire country. Factories shifted to military production. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. American soldiers fought across Europe and the Pacific. By 1945, the United States emerged as a global superpower. It possessed vast industrial capacity, military strength, and nuclear weapons. The post-war world would be shaped significantly by American influence. The Cold War followed, a decades-long rivalry with the Soviet Union. Though direct conflict was avoided, tensions defined global politics for nearly half a century. The space race, nuclear deterrence, and ideological competition became central features of American life. Chapter 13. Civil Rights and the Expansion of Liberty. Even as America projected power abroad, it confronted injustice at home. In the mid-20th century, the civil rights movement demanded the fulfillment of constitutional promises. Segregation, discrimination, and voter suppression were challenged through nonviolent protest and legal action. Landmark legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, dismantled formal segregation and expanded democratic participation. The struggle inspired broader movements for women's rights, disability rights, and greater social equality. The meaning of American freedom continued to evolve. Final chapter: The Unfinished Republic. From revolution to civil war, from industrial rise to global leadership, the history of the United States is not a simple story of steady progress. It is a story marked by conflict, compromise, courage, and contradiction. The ideals declared in 1776,